Let's do this. Your last one of the day. As I said, I find it great that you're all willing to talk about grief. I hope everybody's had a great day. And I won't be able to see anything you put in the chat, but please do put questions. I'll see it afterwards, but I don't know. I have to look at my thing. But we are going to talk about professional grief, coping with everyday losses. I'll try not to go too fast, but you obviously have the PowerPoint stuff you can follow up and look at. The agenda is we're going to talk a little bit about personal loss. We're going to talk about professional loss and grief, burnout and compassion fatigue, secondary stress and vicarious trauma, moral injury, what we do. We do talk about self-care, which is important, but it always cracks me up because I think it's such a broad thing, and then conclusion. So we're going to try to get all this in there. It's 45 minutes. So triggers. I'm going to talk about grief and loss. I know that can be a trigger for some people. And also, I will briefly mention an infant death and a physical accident. And just so you know, because I don't want anybody to have to be surprised and upset. So I start this out with the quote, "To spare oneself from grief at all cost can be achieved only at the price of total detachment, which excludes the ability to experience happiness." And that's really what it's about. We all are social workers or helpers, and we empathize with people, which actually sets us on a maybe more grief. And we have to be able to feel that grief or we won't be able to help people and we won't feel our own joy. So grief is part of the process. And the first part is really a review because you all know about personal loss. You're all human beings. You know it's part of the existence. You know we feel it. And that's just the grief that all of us do that follows the loss of a loved one, a close friend, part of your identity. You change jobs or you lose something or your story changes or your role changes. And these are personal losses that we feel all the time. And the things to remember as a little overview is grief is a feeling attached to loss. Grief is a process, not an event. We don't get just to grieve this afternoon and go on it. But once I did have a client say to me, she came in and said, "Hey, I did what I said you told me to do." And we all know that's kind of we never know what someone's going to say after that. And it's often nothing you've told them to do. And she said, "You told me to take all the day and grieve, and I did, and I'm better." Okay, never told her to do that, but it worked for her. But generally, grief is a process. Grief can accumulate, added losses, add more grief. And obviously, when we start talking about professional grief, we do have accumulated loss. We work with people, we witness for people, and even though we see people at their strongest and their best, often it's underpinning with a lot of trauma and pain. And as with all feelings, grief can't be put off forever. Eventually, it will have to be felt, even though it will hide in our body and hide around and, we'll be at a store and burst into tears for no reason. There's a reason we haven't been feeling our grief. Just finishing up with grief basics. Grief does not have an expiration date. You might feel it now. You might feel it 10 years from now. We all know this. I will say when we work with people, though, it's good to remind individuals of this. I worked with somebody once who came in and was like, "I don't know why I'm not getting over my mom dying." And you'll see why this is interesting when my next line was, "Your mom died unexpectedly 8 days ago." And obviously, nobody gets over their parent dying probably in 8 days, I'm guessing. We all grieve differently. It's not linear, good days and bad days. We actually have physicality and somatic symptoms. Wow, Julie. And grief is complex, evolving process with multiple dimensions. We don't get over losses. Doesn't matter if it happened 40 years ago. We don't get over losses. Kind of end up with the personal grief. This is actually one of my favorite representatives of grief. It basically says, we think with time our grief gets smaller, but our grief doesn't get smaller. Our grief stays the same and our life expands. The things in our world expand. We change and we get bigger around it. There's a link to this, and Lois Tonkin is the one who made this. But this is like one of my favorite things because we think grief is supposed to leave, and it doesn't. We just get through it, and our lives increase. Past grief, accept the loss, experience the pain, adjust and reinvest. And we all know we do that with personal losses, but we're also going to find we do that with professional losses, and it's a never-ending process. So it's just a quick overview of personal loss, because I just figure we've all experienced it. People taking this have probably all maybe worked in it, maybe worked in hospice, worked with clients, worked with the struggles. So I want to focus on professional grief today. And I'm going to go over professional grief and all the different types of it. But professional grief basically is our grief response to our clients. It's how we connect with them, what happens with us. And in a helping profession, we often have multiple and continuing losses related to our work. And it's different than personal loss. Part of it's because we often feel like we're not supposed to feel the same because it's not our lives generally. But it's ongoing and it's constant. And we internalize it because we might have coworkers who have similar situations, but everybody isn't going through what we go home and they're not losing, they haven't lost a loved one, or they're not struggling. With professional grief, we often internalize it. And we're expected to keep working. It doesn't matter if we're having, a client has died. It doesn't matter if, we had to end a relationship with a client or something horrible happened to them. We still have to keep working. And they might go, okay, take a day and get it together, but they're not like, hey, grieve the way you can. We don't get days off for this. We don't get to take FMLA for professional grief. Grief often presents as other emotions. You may instead present with anger, resenting people, resenting your clients, resenting your job, blaming people, helplessness, or guilt. So often professional grief doesn't show the same. You don't manifest it the way you might a personal loss. It may feel like it never ends, because sometimes it doesn't seem to, where everything you do, there's always another step to grief. It's unexpected. We feel like we're not supposed to feel it sometimes. We're fear of people judging us, kind of like getting over it. I actually had a coworker who I loved, but when I was supervising some case managers and they were struggling, they're actually new to the field. They're struggling with clients who had died, expectedly actually died. And she'd be like, well, they need to get over it. It's their job. Well, so people do judge, and hopefully we wouldn't do that, but we do fear that. It can be a significant source of burnout, compassion fatigue, and can also contribute to trauma responses. This is one of my very favorite sayings about professional grief, and that's professional grief is often hidden grief. Professional grief is often hidden grief because we don't get to share it with people. And our relationship with the people we work with, if you're not doing this job, if you're not a helper in this field, it doesn't make sense to everybody. And this quote I'm going to talk in, this is a psychiatrist's quote after a client suicide. He said, I went to the funeral. I stood for the entire service. It was completely packed with people standing. And so I was thinking, as I was listening to this service, that I was the only person in that room who had that particular relationship with that woman. Everybody else knew her in some different way. They were friends, they were family, they were relatives, maybe they knew her in the congregation. And I was the only one who had been working with her, seeing her the day before, trying to prevent this. I felt unique and not in a very flattering way. And I think that really encapsulates sometimes our experience. Think of how emotionally intimate we're with people, appropriately, because that's what we're there for. We're there to witness what they're going through and, sit with them while they're doing stuff. And it's at all levels. It could be helping somebody fill out a public aid application. We're still with them and listening to their struggles and their maybe all the systemic things that go on with them. It could be sitting with a family after someone dies by suicide. It could be just the everyday life that people bring me down. We get to see people in these things, and it does go, it's this emotional intimacy, and we don't always have anywhere to put it out at. And what happens is sometimes we'll doubt competence, like, why can't I get over this? Why? I'm trying to help them. They aren't even being helped, and I feel horrible. We often have the expectation that familiarity with grief and loss makes it easier, but it doesn't minimize grief or the grief process. So even though we might be working for a hospice or working in child welfare where children are being, removed, their families are struggling. Just because we do it all the time doesn't mean we're not going to feel the grief process or get used to it. I mean, honestly, sometimes we will numb ourselves for it. I can't function and cry all day, every day, but it does add up and it does take the toll on us. It doesn't just go away because I've seen it a lot. And the more empathic, the higher risk for heavier grief. And I bet most people who are helpers in this room that one of the reasons you ended up here is because you have great empathy skills and you can put yourself in other people's shoes and be like, I get why this is a struggle. And it does lead to resilience, as we'll see, but it also is a higher risk for heavier grief. And it's important for us to always remember that you can't be doing 20/20 hindsight. We always make the best decisions, even if they're right, even if we're even not sure of them, we make the best decisions we can at that time. And that's all part of it. So I'm going to go over all of these. And the reason I'm including them here is that we have to combat the type of grief differently. Burnout and moral injury are two completely different things. And self-care will help with both of them. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But there's also other things going on. So I'll talk about burnout and compassion fatigue, which I think they're kind of on the continuum. Secondary traumatic stress, vicarious trauma, and moral injury. So most of us would agree burnout is a state of emotional, physical, and mental exhaustion caused by excessive and prolonged chronic stress. It occurs when you feel overwhelmed, emotionally drained, and unable to meet constant demands. Those are the days when you go to work and are like, if one more person talks to me, I'm not going to make it. Burnout, true story. I was working in child welfare at the time, and I was talking to one of my people I supervised. And at the time, I had to use my cell phone, to check my work phone, which was like a landline phone. So I start to use my cell phone to call my landline phone. My landline phone starts ringing, and I go, "Who is calling me now? I don't have any energy to talk to anybody else." And then, of course, my coworker person was like, "It's you. You're calling you." But that's an example of burnout. I was calling me, but the idea of having somebody else call me and talk to me was too much at that moment. And I was okay with me calling me. It worked out. Burnout is different than other stresses felt on the job because we often feel like we're failing. Like, I can't get it together. I'm so sick of this. Why does Jane never get upset? Which Jane does too, because as I've said in my earlier talk, and just I say in general, we're all chaos messes, doing the best we can. Everybody deals with this, but burnout often feels very much on us, like we're doing something that we're not getting it. When I learned about compassion fatigue at the beginning, I was actually told that compassion fatigue was just burnout burnout at the next level. And maybe it is, but I actually don't think that's what it is. But it is kind of an umbrella term over everything. It's a state of exhaustion and dysfunction biologically, psychologically, and emotionally as a result of exposure to compassion stress. As we talked about, empathy, showing empathy for people all the time wears on us. It has been called the price helpers pay to help heal those who with trauma. So I guess it's part of it. Compassion fatigue is related to an individual's empathic response and the desire to improve individuals' lives and society in general. So good, we have good things. And professionals outside of the helping fields usually don't develop compassion fatigue. So it's something that we get to do that not every career gets to do. It can be stressful working in retail. I've done that in my life. That can be stressful and annoying, but you don't develop compassion fatigue. You might not like your people, but you don't develop compassion fatigue. Our field and other helping fields are unique in that it takes a toll on us. Compassion fatigue, burnout, they're often used interchangeable. And I'm going to go on to like secondary stress trauma and vicarious trauma. And we all know primary exposure is an experience of trauma, of experiencing trauma directly, that trauma happens to us. And that's not what we're talking about today, because it's a different response. If trauma directly happens to us, even related to our job, that's one thing. But what, as helpers, we run into a lot is secondary stress trauma and vicarious trauma. So secondary traumatic stress is what we experience from the stories of our clients. And I've been here a long time and I've heard lots of stories. And as I said, I've seen such amazing, strong people. And, it's like humbled to see how amazing people are. But I've also heard such horrible stories and just such realities of people, and not just because of their individual lives, but their experiences with systemic discrimination or just poverty or just pain with their families. And we hear these stories again and again and again, and it does wear us. Secondary traumatic stress is that secondhand trauma when we hear the story again and again. It's the repetition of hearing sad stories again and again. I worked in child welfare for 15 years, and when you really start thinking back and looking at it, you just think of all these people who were trying so hard and just so many lives are affected. Okay, and I felt like I'm being really negative right now, but I'm not. I'm just talking about, there's a lot of joy in that too, but there's a lot of heaviness. And I actually think this is just such a low number, but it said at any given time, 26% of therapists and up to 50% of child welfare workers are at risk of secondary traumatic stress or the related conditions of PTSD and vicarious trauma. But I would guess it's actually much higher than that. It was obviously more pronounced during COVID, but I think most things were. As I talked about, our ability of empathy actually helps because we're able to have compassion, satisfaction too, and that we offset some of the secondary traumatic stress by the joy or pleasure we get when people are able to support change and when they are doing better, and our compassion, satisfaction, which is the good parts of the empathy, helps us be resilient, encourage resilience in others. So I'm going to give you an example of secondary traumatic stress in like a micro section. Like it could be just hearing the same stories, not the same, but similar stories again and again. And I know I used to do crisis work where we work with runaways and lockouts, and almost all the stories are the same. And it all comes down to just people being in a lot of pain, parents not knowing what to do with their kids. The kids, they don't know what to do. And you hear it again, and that adds stress. I'd like to give you an example of something where it actually happened quite quickly for me. I worked having a private practice in another state, and because of a bizarre situation, I was credentialed with an insurance company. There was a company in the town that had a weird mental health insurance company from another state, and that nobody else had this insurance company, and nobody in the area was credentialed with them, mostly because they paid almost nothing. But I had gotten credentialed with them because I worked with somebody who worked at that company, and when they went to work at the company, because we've been doing a lot of work together, a lot of trauma work, and it was like, I'm not going to drop you because of this. But what happened, the consequence was I ended up with many people from this company, and it was a large company, but it still happened that people might know each other. And I had 3 individuals that I was seeing that actually did know each other. And I mean, I never acknowledge that, but they actually sometimes would, because they come in, I know you can't confirm or deny that you know this person, but so one of them who I'd been seeing a while, towards the end of a pregnancy her baby had died, but she ended up having to go through the labor and have a stillbirth. And after this, she came in and we talked, and obviously we went through it, and I just sat and witnessed, because there's no way to make that better. There's nothing we can do in those situations to be like, it'll be fine. It's not. It's probably never going to be fine again. You're just going to expand your life and keep going. And I heard the story. So, it does take a toll. It's a sad story. And then she asked if she'd come back in a few days to bring her husband, and of course. And then I had a client come in who knew her, and I got to hear the story again from a different point of view. And then another client came in and told me the story from a different point of view. And for almost 2 weeks solid, I heard all the versions of this story. And that brought me secondary. I was having reactions, not trauma. It's not like I felt like it happened to me. It's just, it was stressful, and I have to take care of myself, and I have to figure this out. And that's kind of like secondary traumatic stress that happens quickly, but it happens over time. Hearing the stories, I think we all can see how that could be really heavy. On the other hand, vicarious trauma is a bit different. That's indirect exposure to trauma, and it changes the way we look at ourselves and others. It's reliving events of trauma from the stories provided by others, being overly empathetic. So this is almost like you feel like the trauma happens to you. So indirect exposure. So the way we look at ourselves, we all know a lot of times if somebody struggles with PTSD, their brain is kind of doing all or nothing thinkings, like somebody gets, hurt in a fire and then they're suddenly afraid of all fires, or they get trapped in a building, they're afraid of buildings, and just their brain's like, this isn't safe. So vicarious trauma is different than hearing the stories and having it affect you and where you're down. Vicarious trauma is when you have the response that this happened to me too, even though you know it didn't, but you're having the physiological response. So one time this happened to me, I had a new client come in, they're talking to me, and the individual is talking about a family trip and about a partner they have and about being at a resort, having fun, and the kids are there. And then the individual tells me about an accident. Basically said they were doing a tourist thing that everybody does. Not everybody, I haven't done it, but lots of people do it. It wouldn't be weird. And when they were getting back in the boat, something happened, some boat crash. People ended up actually, the propellers of the boat ended up cutting off the person's leg. I'm actually having a response right now. This still bothers me so much. I had vicarious trauma there. I started focusing on it. Not with them at the moment. I was able to be like, get through this. But even though I had never even met the person, because I just met their partner at the time, I was having a vicarious trauma response. Like, it happened to me. Like, I had my legs, I understood that, but I felt the fear. I had intrusive thoughts. I couldn't get it out of my mind. When that happens to us, that's vicarious trauma. And I was very well aware it was vicarious trauma, but that doesn't stop it, because you still have it. And it amuses me that years and years later, I'm still having an emotional response to it. So vicarious trauma is when the trauma experienced by the victim survivor begins to affect the helper in such a way to create distress. So that hyperarousal, heightened reactivity, intrusive thoughts, recurring dreams, avoidance, emotional numbing, anxiety, and depression. So those are all things you might have experienced at some time where you're like, yeah, I really had a hard time with that situation. And that's what vicarious trauma is. And good news, I don't think so, but compassion fatigue, secondary traumatic stress, and vicarious trauma are unintended consequences of being a helper. And this is situations where we have to recognize it, do self-care, and do all these things. And this is part of the grief that we feel as professionals. And I always think these are kind of the continuum on that side. Hopefully everybody's hanging with me. I know we don't have tons of time. And then I want to kind of go on that thing and talk about moral injury, which is different. The first ones I were talking about, often we take that personally as in that's something with us, that's something we should be doing differently. I don't know why I'm being affected by this, all these things. It's very us, like, what did we do wrong? Why am I not able to handle this? In that incident I told you about, the vicarious trauma, it's like I kept saying, well, this didn't happen to me. Why is this upsetting me? So it's very internalized. Moral injury is another area that causes a lot of grief in our work sometimes. It is actually more outer than inner, but it's there. That makes fun. The idea began with the military. Basically, young individuals, mostly young men, would be put into combat where you're basically asked to do things that you're taught all your life not to do. And that kind of does a cognitive dissonance. The harm that results when individuals witness or are unable to prevent incidents that go against their moral beliefs. We all have things that we believe are right and wrong. And I mean, it doesn't even matter what we believe are right or wrong, but often when we're working in systems and working in social work and working in social services and mental health, there are things in the system that don't really mesh with what we believe is right. And this starts causing, or affects us with moral injury. Moral injury occurs when there is a troubling mismatch between the individual's core moral beliefs and the event. Distress arises because the individuals cannot integrate the realities of the transgressions they have perpetuated, witnessed, or experienced with their own moral frameworks. They are unable to make sense or construct meaning out of the morally injurious events. It is this lack of meaning that contributes to poor mental health outcomes. We end up with moral injury because things don't go against what we believe is right, and for whatever reason, why we're doing it the other way doesn't necessarily even make sense. We can't get our brain to be like, yeah, that's okay. We can't talk ourselves into seeing that side. Social workers are presented with incidents such as these regularly, causing moral injury, because while trying to help someone, they may cause or have the potential to cause harm. So our idea is that we want to help people. And when we see we're part of a system that may be harming them, if we're doing behaviors that we feel like might be harming them, and it's not usually things we're choosing to do, it's part of the job we have, it's part of the situation, it's part of how the world works. We struggle when we see that there might be a potential harm. Sorry, getting a drink. Helpers with moral injury, I don't think this would be a surprise, are less satisfied with their work, feel uninspired, not proud of their work. They're less resilient and feel less energy, which makes sense. If I feel like I'm not helping and I'm harming people, I'm not going to be like, woohoo, best job ever. Some example would be maybe you're involved in removing children from their homes in situations you don't think they've had to be removed. I try to work mostly in family preservation for that reason, but then you might have children remaining at homes and you're like, this isn't safe. So when those choices are out of our hands, and as workers they generally are, we can make recommendations, that's a struggle. I remember once when I was starting out that I really thought these two children shouldn't be removed from their home. And I said that to a whole court and they told me I was stupid, and maybe I was because I was young, but those things start causing moral injury. Like, this isn't helpful. It might be a situation of terminating or scaling back services to vulnerable clientele. If a community mental health doesn't have as much money and can't do that. When a few years, Illinois, when I was living there, didn't have a budget in the state for years, which meant Medicaid wasn't getting paid out, which meant community mental health centers who are already struggling with hardly any money started doing things like, if people had spend downs, they wouldn't take, they had all these things that they weren't taking people. So all these people weren't getting services. We definitely need services. And it came down to, that could be moral injury, saying like, these people need help and we can't help them. Lies told clients by agency and staff colleagues. I'd like to believe agencies don't lie to clients, but they do, and they change the truth. They might say you have to do a program you don't have to do. They may forget to tell you have to do a program. They may not be completely honest. Last term, one of my Frostburg, I was teaching a class, and we were talking about just ethics on the job. We're doing individual things, and about one of the things we're going through ethics is to be honest with your clients. I'm a big one on that. You don't have to be blunt or cruel, but there's no reason to ever not be honest. There are probably reasons not to be honest, but generally, honesty is the best way to go. I want people, my service providers, not to lie to me. And the students are like, they just did not believe me that there might be times that people might lie to their clients, or they might ask you to change things in your writing. And one of the girls women in field ended up working somewhere where they asked her to change her case notes. So it was a little less honest, and she was appalled. But kind of apology could be right when you're starting out in the field, but that's a moral injury that, you're asked to say something that isn't quite true for different things. These are all things that can help cause, and a million others. I'm sure if I asked for examples, you guys could give me a million. Witnessing unethical agency practices, when agencies seem to be all about money, and we can all understand they have to have money to survive. I want to get paid. They have to have programs, but when it's all about the money and not as much about the clients, that's hard to maintain. When there are just no options or resources, we've all probably been in those situations, like, I'd love to help you, I have no way to help you, and that can be very stressful. Racism, and everywhere we are, there's racism. When we see that playing out, that can lead to moral injury because we are powerless. We feel powerless. The patriarchy, just stigmatizing behavior. I worked with somebody with a mental illness once. Well, they had a severe mental illness on their diagnoses. They had to go to hospital. They were like 85. They had no symptoms of their mental illness. It just hadn't come up. Somebody in the hospital saw that they had a mental illness on their diagnosis. They actually ended up trying to take this woman's purse because they thought she'd be unsafe because of her severe mental illness, even though she went in there because she was having a stroke. They ended up like body slamming her on the floor and taking her purse. It was one thing after another. She made a police report. She got a letter from the hospital saying, sorry, we didn't meet your needs. And I was annoyed because I thought, because she's a human being, but things like that cause moral injury. I felt so powerless to be like, all I can do to her is witness it and tell her, you're a human being, they shouldn't have treated you like that. And can you imagine working at a hospital and seeing that and maybe not being able to stop it? So these all go to moral injury. When we take it all together, unresolved grief, ignored burnout, secondary vicarious trauma, and moral injury, these are the things we feel, the hypervigilance, hopelessness, inability to embrace complexity. That's where you're working and you're like, I don't know, I can't think anymore. Not being able to listen, avoiding your clients, impatient, anger, sadness, frustration, sleeplessness, fear, dread, chronic exhaustion, all the physicality, minimizing, feeling guilt, struggling with empathizing, and difficulty in interpersonal relationships. So looking at this list, when you start feeling like you have more of these than the empathy positive, that there's probably something where we have to be taking care of ourselves and taking a step back. And we all have times like that. I don't think any of us are immune from having times where we struggle more working with clients than or working with people than others. We all do. Sometimes we're great, we got it all, and sometimes we struggle. And then how do we deal? And one of my favorite sayings is self-care is not selfish, it is self-preservation. I also think ambiguous because I think self-care is so much for different people. And we just say, well, do self-care, you stay on the ball. So I think there was another presentation on self-care, which that would have been a good one for me to go to because I'm always interested in what we do. Remember, we're part of the ecogram that we learned about, the ecomap. We are part of the system, and so we have to take care of ourselves, and self-care is an ethical responsibility. We're that little circle on that ecomap. Self-care and levels of secondary trauma are directly related. So not using self-care actually, taking care of yourself actually decreases the levels of grief and depression. It falls under the Code of Ethics 405, which is impairment. And none of us would do this on purpose, but when we're really struggling with secondary traumatic stress or burnout or moral injury or any of these things, it does affect the way we do our job, and it can be considered impairment. I like to conclude this because include this because it has to do with compassion, and I didn't realize till once that compassion means co-suffering, and so hopefully we can show compassion for ourselves. Compassion is what makes the heart of the good move at the pain of others. Compassion is that which makes the heart of the good move at the pain of others. It crushes and destroys the pain of others. Thus it is called compassion. It is called compassion because it shelters and embraces the distressed. So compassion is what we do in our jobs every day. It's sheltering and embracing the distressed, and including ourselves is important in that. Having compassion for ourselves is no different than having compassion for others. This is important. To have compassion for others, you must notice they are suffering. So one way we have compassion for ourselves is to realize when we're struggling and be okay with it, because you are going to struggle sometimes. Compassion involves feeling moved by others' suffering so that your heart responds to their pain to suffer with. When this occurs, you feel warmth, caring, and the desire to help the suffering person in the same way. So think of how awesome if you can feel that about yourself. Compassion also means that you offer understanding and kindness to others when they fail or make mistakes rather than judging them. Giving ourselves grace. We have hard jobs and life's hard in general. And we sometimes do stupid things and sometimes we make poor decisions. And giving ourselves grace is just such a gift you can give self. And that is part of self-care, realizing that some days we have bad days. And feeling compassion for ourselves is not feeling pity or hating ourselves. It means that you realize that suffering, failure, and imperfection is part of the shared human experience. That having compassion, as I said, it's giving ourselves grace and realizing this is just part of the journey. And I use the word journey. I have a friend who hates it with a passion, but yes, life's a journey. Self-compassion involves acting the same way towards yourself when you are having a difficult time, fail, or notice something you don't like about yourself. Instead of just ignoring your pain, you stop to tell yourself, this is really difficult right now. How can I care for myself in this moment? I think this is such great advice when you're having a bad day. When the next person comes in, you're like, if another person talks to me, I'm going to scream. Recognize when you're struggling and ask yourself that question. How can I care for myself in this moment? Often we just skip that. Often we just like, whatever, I'll get through the day and I'll figure it out. Well, maybe we would be able to better take care of ourselves and others if we stopped and said, what can I do myself in this moment? I'm going to, I'm going to take an hour off work, which I know we can't always do if you're working, you're the social worker in the emergency room and people are there. You can't be like, I'm out of here. But you can say, what can I do in this moment? Can I take 10 minutes? Can I do this? How can I care for myself in this moment? And as I keep harping on a little bit, but most importantly, having compassion for yourself means that you honor and accept your humanness. The more you open your heart to this reality instead of constantly fighting against it, the more you'll be able to feel compassion for yourselves and all your fellow humans. We're just people, and everybody we work with, everybody we know are just people. And I can't say enough that life's hard, that people don't get it together one day and everything's great. Give yourself grace. Okay, feel your feelings. I always tell my clients this. I tell my family that. They're always like, leave us alone. But feel your feelings is the most therapy-like thing I can say. But feelings do not get worse when you feel them. Letting yourself grieve will not lead to burnout. And I think sometimes people think that if I stop and feel this, I'm not going to be able to do this job anymore. If I cried for every time something bad happened, if I got upset, I would be able to get through the day. But that actually isn't how it works. Because once we start feeling it, it stops following us around and it decreases and becomes more manageable. For grief, burnout, trauma responses, and moral injury, acknowledging these feelings are keys to healing. People often don't want to discuss these feelings because it feels like a weakness, but voicing the situation is anything but. Saying, I'm really struggling right now is not a weakness. Saying, I can't talk to another client today because I need to take care of myself. It's not a weakness. It's knowing ourselves and it's feeling your feelings. And reimagine your self-care. And this is why I struggle when we talk about self-care a lot, because self-care is so unique to each of us. What brings me joy and peace may not help others. I sit and I read fan fiction and ridiculous fan fiction. I'll read Harry Potter where it's like he's superhero or whatever. It's just, I do all these things and it amuses me. Maybe there's other women my age who like it. Maybe it's all, 18-year-old females. I don't know, but it works for me. For me, I try to find joys in moments. Are there things that bring you joy? Is there driving along in the car or something? Whatever brings you joy. And I'd actually say for you to take a moment and think of 3 activities that bring you joy. And as you do that right now, just so you don't have to tell me or share with anybody, but think of 3 things that actually bring you joy that could help you in these moments. And it could be just, in between sessions, I'd lie on the floor on my back and put my legs up, and that used to bring me enough joy to get me through the day. I try not to make them all centered around other people. Something that self-care brings joy for me is spending time with my family and doing things and going out to eat, and we just have so much fun together. And that is definitely self-care. But it's important for us to also have self-care that doesn't revolve around spending time and everything with other people. Definitely part of it. I would miss out on that, and that would not be taking care of myself if I didn't do those things. But what can I do alone? So maybe take a moment and think of those things. Think of a few things. Gives me time to get a drink. Be intentional and purposeful about what you can control. There's so much we can't control. I can't stop racism on my own. I can be anti-racist. I can work on that. I can point it out and hold myself to a standard, but I can't change it. So what can I control and what can I do? Think about what you can control. Don't forget that boring self-care is still self-care. When was the last time you went to the doctor? Do you have a primary care physician? Do you go in and get those checkups they tell you to get in? Do you Do your laundry. That's self-care. I'm bad at that. I don't clean, but I could. But that's all self-care. And we think of it as tasks and things we have to do. And we don't have to do it, but that can be self-care if you're going to feel better. So boring self-care is self-care. Stop thinking of fun activities as tasks. How many of you plan and evening to go do something like I'm going to meet up with friends, and all you do is hope that they cancel, or you're going to go away for the day to see a concert and you're just like, this is going to suck, I don't want to do it. I think a lot of us do that, but our work and how we help people is important and vital, but how we live our lives, the fun tasks are actually what our lives are. The going out with friends, and I'm not canceling, going to a concert, going on a hike, taking a walk somewhere, that's what the fun activities. Work on reframing it and not thinking of things that are supposed to be fun as just another task you have to do. Don't ever forget about talking to people and having supervision and peers. I don't have supervision anymore because, I've been in this life, but I do consultation every month with somebody. So if someone's really stressing me out, I got to be like, what? So always talk to people. And if you're in a situation where you're a supervisor or you're a supervisor, that's part of our role as supervisors to meet with people and to let them have the opportunity. Me and my I get in my soapbox a lot sometimes in class about changing the world, because I think every single person in the world, I said the worst advice that was ever given by a professor in school who said you can't change the world. And I think that's ridiculous, because we all change the world every day by every person we touch, who touches somebody else. But the only way to change the world is to start somewhere and take one step at a time. For self-care, pick one situation. I see there's no E. One situation or problem to work with, and then to work with to start. Pick one thing. Like I have to feel better. This is where I'll start. We start somewhere to change the world. Set and keep boundaries at your work. The world will continue to revolve if you go home and your workday ends. I have one friend who is terrible about this. She's working 50 and 60 hours a week in a dialysis center in Illinois. And I think she thinks that the whole place will collapse when she leaves, and it might, but that's not on her. It's not on you if some place does not have enough staff. I know supervisors or managers are like, I need the people. The world will not end if you go home and your workday ends. We can all be amazing. Being amazing and extraordinary can be true. That can be true without you being Superman. You don't have to meet everybody's need. You can be the best human, the best social worker, the most amazing person, and not meet everybody's needs. Learn your strength. And if you're at a job, learn your strengths and see how they mesh with those who work with you. And, build on everybody's strengths. Some of us have different strengths than others. I'm not somebody who I have ADHD to like the 100th power. I know you probably couldn't tell. And monotonous tasks get to me. Yet, like I had one coworker, she loved them. So I do the big ideas and the big thing, and she would do all the monotonous stuff. Worked well. Find your strengths and what you enjoy and mesh with your coworkers. I think this is important. Differentiate toxic work environments from intense work environments. We're all social workers or helpers generally. We got some intense work environments. There are times where, just by the nature of our job, it's going to be stressful, it's going to be high level, it's going to be emotionally draining. That is not the same as a toxic work environment. Toxic work environments, you're probably going to benefit from leaving. You'll have a lot less moral injury and burnout for not being in a toxic work environment. And that's where people don't listen to you. You're belittled. Clients aren't treated well. That's different than intense. So if you're really struggling with working somewhere, ask yourself what's going on. Is it toxic or is it intense? If it's intense, that's when self-care and things work. If it's toxic, it might be time to go somewhere else. Check your negativity, positive self-talk, and healthful interactions instead of negative. I think motivational interviewing talks about the swamp of negativity. Don't get mirrored in the swamp of that negativity. If I have a room full of people who are negative, I can jump in and be very negative. I find that as I've gotten older a little bit, I've changed. I really value the positivity, and I'm not talking toxic positivity, but that maybe realistic, like this is what we're doing. The world doesn't hate me, or if it does, that's just the way it is. But really check our negativity. And I would say if you feel like you're negative every day at work and nobody gets it, that's when you start looking back what's going on. Sit in silence sometimes and allow yourself to be alone. That's something people struggle with. If you're not lots of loss, work with your team to put rituals of remembrance or healing. And that could be like in a dialysis center when something was after somebody died in the paper, and, because we can't just share what people happens, we'd have a memorial board. One of my teams we worked with older people, moving them out of nursing homes into the community. It was a phenomenal job, by the way. But that was how we helped it. Every week, if someone had a client who had died that week, a lot of times we'd have a little moment of silence for them and talk about them for a second, and that really seemed to help my clients, but my caseworkers. But whatever works there. And add rituals of self-care and reflection to your team. I'm not talking about let's all come beyond, sit and talk to each other, but give them options, give them time, give them those moments. Take time off. Don't be the person who has 300 hours of paid leave that you're just waiting to take sometime. Like going home, if you take time off, everything will keep going without you there. None of us are indispensable. I don't mean the bad way, because we're all indispensable, because we're all amazing. But if you're that indispensable agency, you probably are in a toxic environment, or an environment that doesn't work well, because none of us should be indispensable at our jobs. I'll just try to go line of time up. For moral injury, this will help with other griefs. Make sure you have a solid sense of self, understand your moral beliefs so you can make choices accordingly. Check out where you work. Read the mission and value statements. There are times where I've read value statements for places and knew that wasn't a place for me to work because my values just didn't mesh. Don't work at places whose value systems don't mesh with yours. I know that's maybe a place of privilege, because sometimes we just need to work because we need to eat or pay our rent. But when you can avoid it, don't work at places that it doesn't work. If you have the opportunity to talk to other staff, find out what struggles they're having. Speak up. We have an ethical responsibility to speak up, even when nobody agrees with us. You might be the lone voice in your workplace speaking up for injustice or decision-making and practices that harm individuals. You want to help. Speaking up is problematic. We understand you can't always do it, but speaking up confirms your commitment to moral decision-making and will help you make that choice and feel better about it. Sit with your feelings. I can't recommend therapy enough. If you've never gone to therapy, I encourage you to try for a while. There's nothing wrong with you going to therapy. If you don't want to go to therapy, I know therapists who don't want to go to therapy. Ask yourself what you think is wrong with people who go to therapy, or why you don't want to be that person. You're not going to have another neutral person to talk to who actually doesn't get it. Respect yourself, maintain a strong ethical, use a code of ethics when you make decisions, use your knowledge, use problem solving, educate yourself, supervisors and peers. And there we go. That was a whole lot of information, I feel like, in an hour time. And I've lost you all. Okay, there we go. Any thoughts, any quick questions at the end, or lots in chat, but I couldn't read it. Any quick question, anybody? You guys ready to go home for the day? Well, that's all. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me. Let me share the screen quick, because you need the QR code, right?
Yes, please.
There you go. There's a QRC code. My email should be there, juliefanning@holdinghopeservices.org. So feel free to email me if you had a question I didn't answer it or anything.
Thank you, Dr. Fanning.
Thank you, guys. I want you all to have the best Thursday night ever.